Welcome back to my channel. My name's Lucy and I share videos on the topic of long COVID, chronic fatigue syndrome and mind-body approaches that can be used to help those conditions and other mind-body conditions. I also offer coaching to people who are interested in applying a mind-body approach to their recovery and need some support doing that. So today's video, I wanted to talk about the difference between a mind-body approach and CBT, or cognitive behavioural therapy. This is a type of therapy that was at one point recommended for people with chronic fatigue syndrome, and I think it's helpful just to understand what's the difference, because for some people they have tried this, and whether they found it helpful or not helpful, it can be useful to understand what the difference is between this approach and a mind-body approach. And what I'm sharing in this video is based on my own personal experience and my own understanding and knowledge of the mind-body approach and CBT. So if you have other thoughts or ideas on it, or if I leave something out, feel free to comment below and share your experience or share your knowledge. So I was actually asked this question recently and I ended up having a bit of a blank in terms of just trying to know where to even begin with explaining the difference between CBT and a mind-body approach, because they are really different and they really come from different perspectives and were developed for different challenges or different problems that people might have. I used to use a CBT approach in my previous working in the National Health Service in the UK. And when I was assessing people, we would really be thinking about what is this person's challenge. Do they have anxiety? What type of anxiety might they have? Do they have depression? And based on their presentation, do we think that a CBT approach will help them? CBT really was designed and developed to help people with anxiety and depression, using both a cognitive approach where you're becoming aware of your thoughts, and a behavioural approach where you're considering your behaviours and whether you might be avoiding things or whether motivation is a problem if you are experiencing depression. There's various different challenges that CBT can help with. It also helps with some other mental health challenges as well as anxiety and depression. But it wasn't really developed for people with mind-body symptoms. The mind-body approach began from the work of Dr. John Sarno. His theory was based on treating people with unexplained chronic pain and other symptoms. So he was a doctor, and after testing using the normal medical tests, when found to be wrong with a patient, he noticed patterns with these patients and noticed that there were similarities in their personality traits and similarities in some of their coping mechanisms in terms of emotions. So the main things that he identified was that these people often repress emotions or are not aware of some emotions. And they might do this as a coping mechanism. And the idea is that the brain perceives these emotions as dangerous. So we go into a fight or flight state or a shutdown state, and we get all of these symptoms as a result because our central nervous system has control of all of our body, and our nervous system can evoke many different types of symptoms. So when this danger signal goes off in the brain, we end up with lots of different symptoms, and we might be unaware of emotional triggers or emotions that might be causing those symptoms. Often people also have similar personality traits who have mind-body symptoms. So these would be people-pleasing, perfectionism, achiever traits, wanting to be a good person, wanting to do the right thing, conscientiousness, and being a generally hardworking person. So That's one of the big differences between a mind-body approach and CBT. CBT was developed to help people with anxiety and depression, and a mind-body approach really came from the work of Dr. John Sarno, who was working with people who had medically unexplained symptoms, and he was noticing patterns amongst those patients. So a mind-body approach can help people become more aware of emotional triggers that might be causing their symptoms, and it can help them with managing their response to symptoms in terms of building up safer, more positive associations with both symptoms and activity or other triggers that might be related to the onset of symptoms. So for people suffering from long COVID, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain, or other unexplained symptoms, they might benefit from CBT because CBT does involve learning more about yourself. It might involve doing some exercises that are useful. So some of those exercises might be becoming aware of your thoughts and noting down what types of thoughts that you're having. So this is the cognitive component. The cognitive component of CBT also is really thinking about, where did these thoughts come from? Are these thoughts based on your core beliefs, which you developed as a child? So core beliefs are beliefs about ourselves that we develop because of our external situation when we're growing up as a child. So one child may have learned, I'm not lovable or I'm not valuable. That might be a core belief. And a lot of that person's thoughts might be based on that core belief or related to that core belief in some way. So some of their day-to-day thoughts might be, when I meet new people, they don't like me. So that thought might be related to the core belief that I'm not lovable. So CBT can be helpful for self-esteem, it can be helpful for depression, anxiety, and really getting a perspective on our thoughts and really considering, are these true or are they based on our past, and in what way are they based on our past, and how can we rewrite our own story so that our beliefs don't have such a big impact on us, or so that we can notice that these are beliefs, that they're not based on fact. So it's really getting into trying to find evidence for and against thoughts being true or not. Another aspect of CBT is exposure, and this is used for people who are struggling with anxiety. With chronic unexplained symptoms like fatigue or chronic pain or migraines or other chronic symptoms, often we might avoid the things that trigger our symptoms. So that could be activity, it could be certain type of light, it could be certain foods. And so gradually increasing our exposure to these triggers is something that can be really helpful to do. But if you are doing it in a CBT context, they might not take into consideration the reaction that you will have afterwards. So it might be that your symptoms increase after facing this particular trigger or increasing activity. And so that might mean that there are extra layers and extra components that need to be taken into consideration. And if you have a flare of symptoms after doing a particular activity or facing a trigger, the response to the symptoms is really important. And that is part of what a mind-body approach will cover and explain, because that is as important as the exposure itself, because we really want to build up more positive, safe associations with activity or with other triggers, and also with the symptoms themselves. Exposure within CBT might help someone who has chronic symptoms and is trying to face some of the triggers that bring on symptoms, but it also might not be enough of a holistic perspective to make progress, reduce the symptoms, and feel more safe with activities. Because within exposure therapy as part of CBT, they don't really focus on building up associations of safety. Within CBT, the type of exposure is often referred to as graded exposure, and sometimes graded exposure is used as an approach within a mind-body approach. The way that graded exposure works is it involves gradually introducing a feared stimulus bit by bit. Graded exposure, when used with a mind-body approach, often is combined with other things as well, which is different to how it's used as part of CBT. So another element of CBT is behavioural activation, which is basically used for people who are experiencing depression, and because they feel depressed, they lack motivation, and because they lack motivation, they do less, and because they do less, they're more likely to feel depressed and to lack motivation and to lack enjoyment in activity. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Using this approach for someone with long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome could, in some cases, be helpful if that person is also experiencing depression. But it's a little bit more complicated if that person, when they increase activity, will get unexplained symptoms or mind-body symptoms that might need some further support. CBT is a therapy that can be really helpful for people, but if it is used for someone with chronic fatigue syndrome or long COVID, there's a huge proportion of this approach that does not really address the unexplained symptoms, how to respond when symptoms increase, how to build associations of safety with symptoms. And so it could help, but it's unlikely to be the main answer. And I think that is often people's experience. And of course, I think one of the really important things as well is that regardless of whatever approach you are using or whatever therapy you are having, the relationship with the therapist or the coach or whoever is helping you is really important. And if you don't feel understood, or you feel as though someone is thinking that your chronic symptoms are related to anxiety or depression alone, it might mean that there's a mismatch in understanding what you're going through and understanding how to deal with that. So most CBT therapists are excellent and they are really well intentioned if they are trying to help someone with long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome, but they might not understand why the symptoms are there. This is because the approach itself is just not specifically for mind, body, or unexplained symptoms. So let me know your experience or your understanding of the difference between CBT and a mind-body approach. Sometimes people are not open to trying a mind-body approach because they think it is the same as other therapies that they've tried, like CBT. And it can be really helpful just to understand the differences so that if anyone has tried CBT before and it hasn't helped for their symptoms, that there's a reason why that is, because it's not a therapy that was really designed for people with long-term unexplained symptoms. And it could be helpful in terms of helping you with anxiety or depression that you might have alongside that. But even with trying to help someone with anxiety and depression alongside unexplained symptoms, it can be more complicated because of the impact that activity has on people with long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. If you would like to follow me on Instagram or join the Facebook group, there are links in the description below. If you're interested in coaching and you feel you would benefit from some support using a mind-body approach, there are links in the description. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.